Hi everyone, it's Deja Yetmir from CrochetEverAfter.com. This tutorial is going to cover how to double crochet for beginners. So if you've never double crochet before, this tutorial is going to show you how to work into your foundation chain, how to turn your work, how to make the first couple stitches into your row, how to work across the row, and also how to finish off your row. So if you're learning from a book and you're getting a little confused on where to place your stitches, this tutorial is going to show you everything. If you only need a tutorial on maybe just the beginning of the row or the end of the row, I have those broken up so you can just watch that real fast and get going. Otherwise, if you've never done double crochet before, this tutorial is going to cover everything. So let's get started. Okay, we are going to start double crocheting now from the very beginning. I've already put a slip knot on my hook. I have the tail short so you can see it in the picture, otherwise I'd make it much longer for weaving in. But I'm going to chain 12 so that I can make 10 double crochets. And I'll explain that as I go, why I'm only getting 10 double crochets out of 12 chains. So as I work my chains, I yarn over, I twist my hook pointing down towards my stitch to slide easily through, and then I push my loop to my shaft, and that gives me even, consistent foundation chains. And you'll see that I hold on to my loop as I yarn over, and that's just so my foundation chain doesn't come with me. And then when I go to pull my loop through, I grab my foundation chain to keep it steady. So I turn and I do all those things at once to create each foundation chain. So let's see how many I have so far. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I'm going to do 3 more. 1, 2, and 3. Alright, so to begin my double crochets, when I write double crochet patterns, I always count my chain 3s as a double crochet. So that means every time that I chain 3 for the proper height for my double crochet, it's going to count as a stitch. And that also means on my foundation chain, because every foundation chain for double crochet, you're always going to work into the 4th chain from your hook. And that means you have a loop on your hook, that's the working loop, you don't count it as a chain, you count backwards, so you have 1 chain, 2 chain, 3 chain, and 4 chains. You're going to work into this loop. So those 3 chains that I skipped are not only going to give me the proper height for my double crochet, so the very first one's not all squished down, but it's also going to count as my very first double crochet. So I'm going to yarn over, and I'm going to insert my hook into that 4th chain. You can insert into the back loop, under the back loop, and bottom bump to catch 2 loops. You can insert through the 2V, the actual V, and over your bottom bump. However you like. I like to do the back loop, it's just the fastest for me, and I don't mind the 2 loops that are down below because they kind of make a little foundation chain on the bottom of my work. But I'm going to insert my hook in, yarn over, or lay over as I always say, and pull that loop up. And I don't pull it all the way up to make the same height as my chain 3. I keep it so that the loop is the size of my shaft. So it squishes down my chain 3, but you'll see as I make my stitch, it's going to grow. So it grows by yarning over and only working through the first 2 loops that are on my hook. I pull through that yarn over just through those 2. And you'll see that my stitch is now almost the same size as this chain 3. Then I'm going to yarn over and pull through the last 2 on my hook, and that's going to create my double crochet. So now I have 2 double crochets. I have the first one that I actually made and my chain 3. Now I need to work into my next chain. And you'll see I call these stacked V's because they look like the letter V stacked on top of each other. So each V is 1 chain. So my next V is right here. And I like working into the back loop, so I can also just kind of pull and find that back loop. You always yarn over before you insert your hook for double crochets. So I insert it into that back loop, lay over my yarn to catch it, pull it up and push it to the shaft. Don't pull it loose. Then I'm going to yarn over and go through just the first 2 loops. And you'll see that I'm working kind of at a 45-degree angle with my hook. It's going diagonally up. With a single crochet, I'm usually parallel with my work as I pull my loops through. With a double crochet and everything higher, you're going diagonal. So as you make each of those 2 loop pull-throughs, it increases the height on your stitch. So when you get to treble and double treble, you see that every time you pull through just 2 loops, it's going to make the stitch higher and higher. I'm going to yarn over, find my next loop, which is right there, insert my hook, lay over my yarn, pull up, push to my shaft, yarn over diagonally, and I point my hook down to slide through easily, and then I push my loop to my shaft again, yarn over, turn it down, and pull through the last 2. So I'm going to do the next ones at regular speed, kind of. I'd probably go a little faster if I tried, but I'll do it kind of easy speed so you can see them and see how it kind of flows as you get the hang of it. And you'll see that every time I'm always pushing my loops to my shaft, and that gives me even, consistent stitches. It's going to give me nice, even height stitches. If I didn't put it to my shaft, or if I kept my loops loose, I'm going to get much bigger or shorter stitches, and my project's not going to look as good out overall. So this last chain, sometimes it can get quite small when you're making your foundation chain, because you might make that very first one kind of tight. If you're not sure if that's part of your slip knot or it's an actual chain, just count how many stitches you've made so far. Remember, I said I was going to make 10 double crochets. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and my chain 3 is my 9th stitch. So I know that I need 1 more, so I know that definitely is a foundation chain. And remember, I did 12 chains, and I ended up with 10 double crochets. So if you're counting your chain 3, and you're designing something for yourself when you're making double crochets, you're going to foundation chain the amount of double crochets that you want and add 2. So I wanted 10 double crochets, so I made 10 foundation chains plus 2, so I made 12, because that very first chain 3 is counting as a stitch. If I didn't count this chain 3 as a stitch, then I would have foundation chain 13. Sometimes the chain 3s won't count as stitches. Your pattern should hopefully tell you whether it does. I usually have my chain 3s count. This next part is the important part of knowing whether your chain 3s count, because it's going to dictate where you need to insert your hook for the first stitch of your row. No matter what, you're going to have to chain 3 for the proper height. Sometimes patterns will say chain 2 for double crochets, and that's up to the designer. Sometimes they do that just to make them less noticeable if they're not counting them as a stitch. But if they count them as a stitch, it's usually going to be a chain 3. So I count mine as a stitch, which means that I don't work into this very first V. This V is being used by this chain 3. So that means my very first double crochet is going to be in the second stitch, the second V. So I insert my hook under both loops. For regular double crochets, you have to go under both loops, and you can always stop and look and make sure you only have 2 loops on your hook, besides your yarn overs and such, but just the 2 that you insert your hook into. You can also see that there's quite a big hole for you to insert your hook into, but sometimes you might be tempted to go in this big space. That's not the correct area. You're going to have an extra loop on your hook. You need to go above this loop and below the 2 loops. So you insert your hook, lay over, and same steps as before. Push to your shaft, go through the first 2 loops, push to your shaft, yarn over, and go through the next 2 loops. Now, let me take that one out. If your pattern says that your chain 3 doesn't count as a stitch, what you're going to do is instead of inserting your hook into that second stitch, you're going to insert your hook into that very first stitch. So if it's hard to see because of your chain 3, you can see it looks a little bit less defined because you have your chains here. It's not as easy to see the hole. You can turn your work and look for your V. So you can see your V is right there. So you can insert your hook under that V. So if your chain 3s do not count as a stitch, this is where you need to begin your first double crochet. And this chain 3 is going to just kind of bubble out. That's why I like to count it as a stitch, because I think it's not quite as good looking with that big bubble on the end of your row, because it's only going to be on one side of your row. So I'm going to pretend that our chain 3 counts. So I'm going to go into this next stitch, and I'm going to do my double crochet. So as you work, you can pull on your stitches to find where your next stitch goes, or you can turn and look for your V's to find where your next stitch is. On dark yarn, if you're crocheting with black yarn, it can be difficult to see your stitches, so you want to work in bright light. But that can help you if it's difficult to see. Look for your V's to find them. Bulky yarn's really good to use when you're first learning, because all of these spaces, all of these holes are much larger. Everything's much more pronounced. So I always recommend bulky yarn to learn. So as you work across, you're going through both loops. So when you're reading a pattern, it'll say insert your hook under both loops, and that just means under the entire V. If you're doing a back loop only or front loop only project, then you're only going to go under one loop. But most double crochets are going to be under both loops. Then, when you get to the end of your row, you have to remember if your chain 3 counts as a stitch, because you need to know this to figure out if you need to work into it. So because my chain 3 counts, I have 2 more stitches left. And even though it may only look like 1, because you only see one really defined V, but I can stop if I'm not sure and count how many stitches I have. I should have 10. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then I have 8, which is my chain 3. So I should have 2 more stitches. And that is my chain 3. So I'm going to do my double crochet, my 9th one here. And then my 10th one is going to go into this chain 3. You can insert your hook kind of wherever you want. You can turn to find your actual V's, or you can insert your hook just right here where you're at. I like to catch 2 loops when I work into these chains, and I'm going to show you why. So I'm going to do one with 2 loops so you can see. You can see it kind of just works as, it looks more like a normal double crochet now. If I were to work under just one of the loops of the chain, you can see that it creates kind of a big hole here. It pulls all my chains, it squishes them down a little bit and makes this really big hole. So I try to catch 2 loops when I work into a chain. Whatever 2 loops you can grab is fine. It's not that important. But you're always going to work into that top of the chain 3. Now, if my chain 3s did not count as a stitch, I would leave that unworked. This actual last double crochet would be the last stitch of the row. I would still have 10 because at the beginning of my row I would have double crocheted into that very first stitch. So if I counted, I would still have 10. So depending on if you're counting your chain 3s as stitches is going to tell you what your last stitch of your row is going to be. So make sure that you know so that you don't lose your stitches, because you can end up losing stitches very easily by not working into that chain 3. And then you're going to turn your work in chain 3 and continue working across. And what you can do at the end of your project, depending on what you're making, if you're making clothes and you're going to seam it, you're going to be using this first stitch of every row as part of your selvage. If you're a sewer, that's going to be caught in your seam and you're not going to see it. If you're making your beginner and you just want to make a scarf out of double crochet, just work all the way up and then you can put an edging around the entire thing. You can do single crochets to hide the skinny chain 3s if you want. So if you're doing double crochets, you can do 2 or 3 into each double crochet in each row, depending on how tight you crochet, because everybody crochets differently. You might have really tight double crochets or really loose. Don't worry about it. Just adjust your hook if you're actually trying to match the gauge of a design in a pattern. But that is how you're going to double crochet from the very beginning.